Hello, and thank you for choosing this full length, clean, historical Western romance by Kat Lynn. We are so happy to have you with us today. Before we begin, don't forget to tap the subscribe button and like and share with your friends. Your support allows us to continue sharing these sweet, heartwarming stories for free. Now, relax and get ready to travel back in time to the American frontier, where we join an adventure to find love and happily ever after. Enjoy. Copyright of Kat Lynn, Colorado Storm by Kat Lynn. Chapter 1. New Orleans, Louisiana, 1862. Violet Dixon slowly dabbed at her eyes again, the flood of tears seemingly unstoppable, and a white handkerchief clenched tightly in her hand, almost drenched in the salty liquid. The reality of the terrible news she had received was now slowly sinking in. It was the same kind of pain she had experienced 6 years ago when she was only 16 years old, after being informed that her mother Vivian had died from the flu. "Uncle Robert, please tell me that all this is a bad dream and that I'm going to wake up and hear my father's voice again," she said to her uncle, who sat pensively in an armchair across from her. "I'm afraid it's all true, my dear. My dear brother Jeremy has passed away, and we should make haste and inform our friends so we can start his burial arrangements," her uncle replied, and Violet noticed that apart from his pensive look, his voice was void of any emotion. Violet's mind slowly drifted back to earlier that morning when her father had bid her farewell as he went to work. Gibson, his coachman, had been trying hard to get him out of the house in a hurry, but for some reason, Violet's father had kept lingering on wanting to talk to his daughter some more. She now wished that he had stayed home for the day, and maybe the terrible accident that had claimed his life would not have occurred. "I wish I had kissed him goodbye a second time," Violet sadly thought, as a lump caught in her throat, and she swallowed hard. The lack of emotion in her uncle's voice had also caught her by surprise. As her father's business partner at the warehouse and the only person who witnessed the accident before rushing his brother to the town's physician, Dr. Williams, her uncle's mannerisms made her uneasy. Uncle Robert wasn't the most emotional person. Most of the time came off as rude and callous, but having witnessed his only brother die practically in his arms, should have elicited some kind of emotion, Violet thought. "Uncle Robert, there is something that I don't understand. How did my father slip and fall so easily? He always has been very careful around the warehouse," Violet asked her uncle, who was staring at her with a look she couldn't discern. "Unfortunate accidents like this happen all the time, my dearest. He must not have realized that there was oil spilled on the floor. I certainly didn't. Try not to think about it too much and accept that the worst has happened, and we have no choice now but to move on," he replied nonchalantly. The manner in which he explained how the accident happened was hard for Violet to comprehend. Her father was the most careful person she knew, and her tummy tied to a knot every time she thought of how he had fallen, knocking his head on the hard cement floor. Uncle Robert had explained that Violet's father had split his head open after the fall, and that was why there was nothing Dr. Williams could do to save him. That night, as Violet lay on her bed, willing for sleep to come, images of her father's last moments alive haunted her until she finally fell into a restless slumber. They buried her loving father 3 days later in a small but well-attended ceremony. Mr. Dixon had been a good friend to many around their town as well as the next town, and everyone had been shocked by his untimely demise. Violet looked on, determined to remain strong in front of the mourners, even though her heart was breaking. "Take heart, dearest. Don't hesitate to ask me for whatever you may need," Mrs. Matthews whispered to Violet, as her wrinkly arms went about Violet's shoulders and her plump face smiled kindly at her. "I shall, Mrs. Matthews, and thank you for your kindness. But I promise you, I shall be fine," Violet answered, and the old lady smiled at her and went on her way. Days later, the family lawyer Charles came to the house to read the will, accompanied by Violet's uncle. Robert had been in a hurry to know the contents therein, and Violet couldn't help but feel that there was more to his interest than he was letting on. "Well, Miss Dixon, those were your father's wishes, and if there isn't anything else to add, I shall be on my way," Charles said, his round face showing no emotion. Are you sure that's all there is, Charles? Robert asked, a look of disbelief evident on his face. I'm afraid so, Mr. Dixon. The bulk of Jeremy's estate goes to his daughter Violet, as it's clearly stated in the will, Charles replied, a knowing look on his face. Robert was clearly jealous that his brother left so much to his daughter. As Violet lay in her bed that night, the scenes during the will reading bothered her a lot. Her uncle had seemed unhappy with the contents of the will as he tried to get Charles to read the will a second time. She could have gladly given everything back if it meant having her parents back with her. She was beginning to see another side to her uncle that she had always known was there, but had been too afraid to accept. She finally fell asleep and dreamt about both her parents. The following morning, as Violet sat by the window in the drawing room, her mind still in a haze, she saw her uncle's carriage pull into the driveway, and she felt apprehensive of his visit, as she didn't know what he wanted so early in the morning. "Good morning, dearest," he thundered as he waltzed into the drawing room, his huge belly hanging down almost to his knees. Violet thought he looked like an overfed toad, and she stifled a laugh, afraid he would notice. "Good morning, Uncle. What brings you here at this time of the morning?" Violet asked, keeping a straight face. "I have thought of how best we should grow the business for our mutual benefit," he announced as he propped himself down on the couch. "That's great, Uncle. How do you propose we go about it?" Violet asked, her curiosity aroused. "We should get married as soon as possible. That way, we will combine both of our wealth and become one of the richest couples in this town and yonder," he answered, completely unaware of Violet's horrified look. Violet struggled to answer her uncle, but try as she might, her throat felt dry, her heart dropping to her stomach. Everything was now beginning to make sense, and she could now see her uncle for whom he truly was. There was no way she was going to agree to such a disgusting and vile arrangement. She had to find a way out of this predicament. Surely, this was not what her father would have wanted for her. Chapter 2. Denver, Colorado, 1862. Storm Lucas rode his horse at a slow trot as he neared his house. These afternoon rides relaxed his mind and helped him escape from the loneliness he felt in the house, which was now a former shell of itself. Since Dorothy had left, he felt a mixture of both relief and a small measure of regret. Maybe if he had tried harder, their marriage would have survived, but he knew this to be not true. Dorothy herself had long given up on their union. "This marriage is no longer working for me, and I ask myself what I'm still doing here with you," she had retorted one morning as they argued, which had become the order of each day. "Of course it's no longer working. Why would it be when you spend all your free time with your gentleman friend? He is only here for a while until he trades all his goods and soon be on his way, you know." Storm had retorted back, regretting ever allowing the traveling merchant to stay at his ranch. That evening, Dorothy had moved from their bedroom and settled in the spare guest room without uttering a word to Storm. He, in turn, hadn't bothered to engage her, leaving her to stew in her own anger. Their relationship was headed for the ruins, and Storm was only too eager to give her a divorce if she asked for one. They had no children, and he figured that would make it easier. Days later, Storm realized that both Dorothy and the traveling merchant were nowhere to be found on the ranch, and word soon got to him that they had both run off. Now, as he rode back to his home, all this seemed like a distant memory. He had not bothered to go after Dorothy, choosing to let her and the merchant be. Love was not for him, he had decided. As much as his brothers tried to set him up on dates with lasses from around the town, none fascinated him, and he had admonished his brothers from continuing to do so. After all, they were younger than him, and might fare better in love than he had. The tall figure lingering around the cattle shed roused him from his trail of thoughts, and as he looked closer, realized it was his younger brother Luke. He looked excited as he paced around near the shed, and Storm wondered what had got him that way. Luke waved as soon as he spotted Storm, gesturing for him to quickly come closer. "I have been waiting for you to come back for ages, Storm," Luke said as soon as Storm got to where he stood pacing to and fro. "Well, brother, here I am. What has you in such high spirits?" Storm asked, slapping his younger brother on the back playfully with his open palms. I have news that I know will have you excited, just like I am, Luke replied. Okay, should we go inside the house, or would you rather speak here? Storm asked, his curiosity now clearly aroused. We might as well go inside. I'd rather have you seated when I give you the news, Luke answered. As Storm led his brother into the house, his mind was in turmoil. What did Luke have to say? He wondered. Out of his 5 younger brothers, Luke was known to be the most impulsive. He would act and think later. This kind of behavior had landed him in trouble more than once, and Storm had always been the one to sort out his problems. Their parents died in an accident when their cart fell off the edge of a cliff, killing both of them instantly. Storm had then been only 18 years old. Since then, he had taken over looking after his brothers and had done quite a good job, Luke's antics notwithstanding. Out with the news, brother, Storm said as he showed his brother to a beige couch by the window, and he sank in next to him. I have decided to get married, Luke said, grinning from ear to ear. What and to whom? I didn't know you had a fiancé, Storm said, a shocked expression on his face. I don't, but I'm going to get one soon, Luke replied as Storm continued staring at him in disbelief. Prior Court. I don't see how that's going to work. How do you know whomever you choose will agree to marry you so soon? This is unheard of, Storm replied. Calm down, Storm. I'm going to order for a bride from the East through the Matrimonial Times newspaper. It's very simple. You place an ad in the newspaper and then wait for the ladies to reply. After that, you choose the one that most appeals to you. Luke explained to a baffled Storm, who could hardly believe what his brother was talking about. Long after Luke had left, Storm still sat on the couch, shocked by what his brother had told him. Once when he had been at the local tavern, he'd heard some men talking about a friend of theirs who'd ordered a bride from the East. They claimed the man had hit the jackpot and now was a father of 2. Storm hadn't paid much attention to the conversation, as he was neither interested nor planning to ever get married again. Now, Luke had come up with the same absurd idea, and Storm knew his brother always did as he wished, and there would be no talking him out of it. He'd just have to wait and see how it all unfolded. Chapter 3. Violet tossed and turned restlessly in her bed, her mind in turmoil. 3 weeks had passed since the awkward announcement from her uncle, and she still hadn't found a way out of her predicament. Days after the incident, her uncle had tried to discuss the arrangement with her once more, but she had rebuffed him and locked herself in her room. He had furiously left the house and hadn't returned since then. Violet knew he had not actually given up and must have been racking his brain on how to follow through with his diabolical plan. Feeling overwhelmed, Violet slowly dragged herself out of bed, deciding to go to Mr. Frederick's store and stock up the pantry. The cool, crisp morning air would help clear up her foggy mind, and she might finally think of a way to defeat her uncle's evil plans. Good morning, Violet. How are you holding up, dear? Mrs. Matthews asked, her eyes full of concern. She was coming out of the store and couldn't have been happier to see the young lady. I'm holding up just fine, Mrs. Matthews. Thanks for asking, Violet replied, though wanting desperately to let the kind old lady in on what her uncle was plotting. Your face says otherwise, dearest. Is everything okay at home? Mrs. Matthews pried on. Yes, Mrs. Matthews, all is well at home. If I look somewhat sad, is probably from missing my father. Violet replied, and a sharp pain pierced through her heart, bringing tears to her eyes. She quickly turned her face to the side lest Mrs. Matthews noticed. Violet was not one to break down easily, and she always cringed at the thought of anyone seeing her weakness. Well, dear, that is quite understandable. Your father was a good man. We all miss him terribly, Mrs. Matthews replied, sadness etched in her voice. It was good to see you, Mrs. Matthews. Have a wonderful day. Violet said, desperate to get away before she broke down in front of the kind soul. The store was quiet during that time of the day, and the calmness helped Violet walk around in peace. Even though the townsfolk meant well, she was becoming tired of having to answer all their questions about how she was faring after her father's death. A movement from the corner of her eye caught her attention, and she turned to see the store's owner, Mr. Frederick, slowly walking towards her, a sad look on his face. Here we go again, Violet thought, exasperated. Hello, Miss Dixon. It's so good to see you. Can I help you with anything? Frederick said as he approached her, his plump face somber. Hello, Mr. Frederick. It's good to see you too. I need some food stuff, and I don't think that should be too hard. Let me not bother you, sir, Violet answered, hoping her tone wasn't too cold. She wouldn't want to come off as rude, but wasn't ready to answer any more questions about her well-being. Okay, Miss Dixon, Frederick said as he turned and walked back to the front of the store. Violet slowly walked around the store, picking up everything she needed as she ticked off the shopping list in her mind. She was careful not to take too much, as there was no one to share with at home, and eating alone had become quite hard for her. As she bent down to pick up a loaf of bread, Violet's eyes landed on the newspaper stand, and the Matrimonial Times publication caught her interest. She picked it up and decided she would read it later that night when sleep failed her. She paid for the items at the front, and as she stepped out of the shop, the blinding sun glare caught her eyes, and she was shocked that she had overstayed in the store. That night, after her lonesome dinner, Violet skimmed through the publication without much interest until her eyes fell on the ads page. They were many and mostly from men in the West looking for wives, and as she quickly ran her eyes through, one ad caught her attention. It was from a man in Denver, Colorado. 25-year-old rancher from Denver seeks a serious young lady below 25 years of age and willing to live on a ranch. She should be ready to become a wife, a close companion on the ranch, and happy to start a family with me. Violet read the ad a couple more times, and the more she read it, the more appealing it became. Moving to Denver would certainly rid her of her uncle, and she would also have a chance to start her own family with a man close to her age. She was a bit apprehensive of this kind of arrangement, but she had heard talk around her town that it was an accepted way of life in the West. Being in the fix that she was in, she couldn't think of a better way of fleeing New Orleans, other than this. Her mind finally made up, Violet walked over to her small writing desk, picked up a quill pen, ink, and a plain sheet of paper. She stared at the blank sheet of paper, her mind racing furiously as she tried to find the words to pen a worthy and notable reply. Suddenly, her uncle's evil grin as he tried to talk her into marrying him flashed through her mind. And in that instant, she knew exactly what she had to do. She dipped her pen in the ink and carefully started writing, words now flowing freely, and a warm, calm feeling filled her heart. Chapter 4. Luke read the stack of letters one more time, his heart racing and a feeling of panic overcoming him. When he came up with the idea of placing his ad in the Matrimonial Times, he hadn't thought that he would be receiving so many replies. It was true then what he'd heard around town that girls from East longed to get married in the West. I should have given this idea more thought, he admonished himself. It was rumored that they believed they'd find better prospects there, and going by the huge number of letters he held in his hand, it must have been true. He'd already informed his brothers that he would be getting married soon, and stopping now would make them think that he had failed. No way was he going to humiliate himself in that manner. One letter in particular was articulate, was written in a casual, friendly manner, but had a hint of seriousness in it too. He placed the rest of the letters down on the floor next to him as his attention turned to the one that had tugged at his heart. Dear Sir, I read your ad with a lot of interest. I'm Violet Dixon, 22 years old, and I live in New Orleans, Louisiana. I believe I am the companion you're looking for, as life on a ranch would excite me very much. I wish to make your acquaintance soon should you accept my proposal. Yours sincerely, Violet Dixon. Luke liked the fact that she was so young. Most of the other ladies had been his age, while others were a couple of years older, which did not appeal to him. The lady hadn't said much about herself, and this only heightened his curiosity. He decided there and then that she was the one and he would be writing back to her. 3 weeks later, Luke received a letter back from Violet, and thus their correspondence had begun. She was eager to come to Denver, and Luke felt that he was being rushed, even though he'd stated in his letters that he wanted to meet her soon. In her last letter, Luke felt that she was beginning to grow impatient, and he knew that if he kept delaying their meeting, then she would most likely call the whole thing off. Not knowing what to do, Luke went to the only person who seemed to know how to sort out his problems, his eldest brother Storm. "She won't wait any longer, and I don't think I'm ready yet," Luke complained to his brother, who was looking at him with a knowing expression. "But you have been telling the lady you are ready to meet her and get married. Of course, she's not happy that you keep dragging your feet. You need to make up your mind before you lose her," Storm replied. Storm knew from the first time Luke came to him with the idea that Luke was acting on a whim and would eventually want to pull away, but it was now too late. Luke had been in correspondence with the young lady for a while now, promising her heaven on earth, and it would be heartbreaking for her if he let her down at the last minute. As usual, Storm had to think of a way to convince Luke to do the right thing. "Where will she stay?" "She obviously cannot stay in my room before we are married," Luke complained, and Storm couldn't believe Luke hadn't thought about all this before going ahead with this plan. "Just ask her to make the travel arrangements. Before she arrives, we will have thought of how best to accommodate her," Storm replied, regretting the words as soon as they left his mouth. "Thanks, Storm. I always know I can count on you," Luke said, a big smile on his face. "I will write her tonight and ask her to be on the next train to Denver." Long after Luke had gone back to his room, his load lighter, Storm sat alone on the porch, his mind in turmoil. A nagging feeling in his heart told him that this marriage was beginning on a very bad note. As was usual with Luke, he never thought ahead before acting, and now a poor lady's life might be ruined by his reckless behavior. Hamley. Storm didn't know how long he could keep on rushing to Luke's rescue every time he messed up. In the days that followed, Luke let his other brothers, Eric, Thomas, Henry, and Greg, know that his bride would be arriving on the next train from Louisiana. They all registered surprise on their faces, but since everything had been already arranged, all they could do was wait to welcome the new member of their family. They had all agreed that Violet would stay in their parents' old room that was on the top floor of the farmhouse. It had been years since anyone had stepped in that room, and it was in a desolate state. They decided to clean it up together and make it pleasant for when Violet arrived. Everything was in place, and all Luke could do was to wait to pick up Violet from the train station on the day she would arrive. As the day neared, Luke found himself growing more and more apprehensive, and his panic attacks increased. He kept his feelings and doubts from his brothers, as he didn't want to look like a failure to them. He found himself going to the saloon more times than he'd done earlier, as well as spending more time there entertaining the ladies. All of a sudden, they didn't look too unappealing, and he found himself wondering why he hadn't chosen one of them instead. Luke's behavior wasn't lost to Storm, and as the days went by, the turmoil in his heart only got worse. There was no doubt now that Luke was having second thoughts about his bride-to-be, but it was too late to do anything about it. She was already on the train coming to Denver, and she would be arriving in a fortnight. Storm braced himself for the raging storm that was soon coming his way. Chapter 5. "Your ticket, madam." The conductor's loud voice jolted Violet from her musings. She reached inside her small purse and gave the small bit of paper to the man to inspect. Satisfied that all was well, the gentleman returned the ticket to her and walked over to the next passenger. Violet laid her head back, attempting to catch some rest, but it was futile. Her mind was too preoccupied to allow her any rest. The past couple of months had been trying for her, and as she now sat in the train heading to Denver, she wondered what the future had in store for her. She didn't know whether she had made the right decision, packing up and heading to the West to meet a man she didn't know from Adam. This feeling had been heightened by his last letter, where she had caught some underlying tones of uncertainty. "Dear Violet, I feel the time is now ripe for us to meet face to face. I apologize for taking longer to reply to your letter. An urgent matter came up, which needed my immediate attention, Enclosed is some money for your travels. I will be waiting for you at the train station in a fortnight. Yours sincerely, Luke Lucas. The letter was somewhat cold and lacked the enthusiasm he had when they'd first started communicating. The tone was now lukewarm, and Violet felt like she was playing second fiddle, which infuriated her. She couldn't understand which matter Luke was talking about that could have led him to give her the cold shoulder for weeks. A nagging, negative feeling gnawed at her heart, but she willed it away. Violet's thoughts turned to her uncle, who had no idea what she was up to. She had kept a low profile since their last meeting, rebuffing his numerous attempts to see or speak with her. It troubled her that he thought she could even consider such a vile arrangement. It was taboo, and the very sheer thought of it almost made her gag. She had planned for this journey quietly, never confiding to a soul. She would write to the family lawyer Charles when she got settled in Denver to let him know where she was in case he needed to speak with her. By the time her uncle realized that she had run off, it would be too late for him to do anything. She mused as a sly smile escaped her lips. She had won. "Are you all right, dearest?" The elderly lady seated on the opposite side of the aisle asked, having noticed Violet's mixed expressions. "Yes, ma'am. I'm fine, thank you," she replied. "I'm just tired from the journey." "Is this your first time traveling this far?" the lady prodded on. "Yes, ma'am, it is," Violet answered. The lady was sweet and wanted to talk, but Violet just wanted to be left alone to her thoughts. "Well, not to worry. You will get used after a couple more trips," the lady replied, her pleasant smile never leaving her aged face. "Do you know how far we are till we arrive in Denver?" Violet asked. "It should be in a day or two. I used to be eager just like you, but now I don't pay the distance much thought," the lady answered as she laid her head back on the headrest, and Violet was relieved she wouldn't be answering any more questions. Violet's mind strayed back to Luke and his mixed signals. She wondered whether she had been too eager to leave New Orleans, that she might have missed some warning signs. His letters started warmly, sometimes lately a bit cold, and Violet wished she had given him more time to make up his mind. He had kept on delaying their face-to-face meeting until Violet was ready to call the whole arrangement off and possibly think of another way to get away from her uncle. Suddenly feeling overwhelmed, Violet laid her head back, closed her eyes, and fell asleep. Violet was startled from her sleep by the sounds of people dragging their suitcases up and down the aisle as they hurried to exit the train. She hadn't realized she'd fallen asleep, and as she looked around, dazed, trying to figure out what was going on, the elderly lady she had spoken with earlier noticed her confused look. "You fell asleep, dear. It was long overdue," she said, breaking into pearls of laughter. "What is going on?" Violet asked, wondering what the commotion was all about. "Nothing, my dearest. We have arrived in Denver, is all," the kind lady answered as she pulled her bags from under her seat. She turned to Violet, waved goodbye, and stepped off the train. Violet was overcome with a mixture of relief and uncertainty as it finally dawned on her that she had actually made it to Denver. Suddenly, her feet became too heavy to move as panic and a feeling of dread washed over her. She immediately chided herself for that brief moment of weakness. Looking around her, she was now the last person left on the train. Quickly, she reached below her seat, dragged out her 2 bags as she simultaneously got to her feet and headed for the exit. She slowly set down her 2 bags and looked around, trying to see if she could spot Luke. He said he would be waiting for her, and as her eyes swept around, all she could see was a swarm of strangers going about their business, all completely oblivious of her presence. Chapter 6. Luke walked slowly towards the front of the platform, his eyes darting from side to side as he tried to spot Violet. She had described to him what she would be wearing, instead of sending him a photo of herself when he'd requested it. Luke found it strange that she wasn't comfortable sending him a photo of herself. Did she have a facial defect that she was trying to hide from him? He would never forgive her should that be the case. He shook off the negative feelings as he had not sent her one either. She hadn't asked. "Look where you're going, mister," a young boy, probably 14 or so, shouted angrily at Luke, who had bumped hard into him. My apologies, young man, I didn't see you, Luke answered, noticing how dirty and unkempt the young boy looked. He seemed malnourished, and Luke could tell that he was most likely homeless as well. I accept your apology, but next time, be more careful, the boy answered as he turned and hastily walked away. Luke watched the boys retreating back until he was swallowed up by the huge crowd. The town was full of such riffraff, and Luke wished that the sheriff would round them up, lock them in prison, and throw away the keys. They were of no help to anyone, and the town folk would be better off without them. Where were their parents anyway? Luke wondered. As he neared the front of the platform, a person's silhouette caught the corner of his eye. He slowly went towards the figure, his heart thumping hard in his chest. "Miss Dixon?" he cautiously called out as he reached where the lady stood. "Yes, Mr. Lucas?" she answered as she turned in his direction. "Yes, it's Luke Lucas. I'm glad that you finally made it," he replied as his eyes carefully appraised her. She had a small frame, big blue eyes, and the softest, milky white skin. She didn't get out much, Luke thought to himself. Her hair was blonde beneath her bonnet, and a few strands had escaped the straps, framing her oval face beautifully. A gush of wind suddenly blew towards them, sending a handful of sand flying into her face. Violet gave a small cry as she quickly tried to shield her face with her hand to no avail. The sand got into her eyes, making them water and making her cough. "Here, take my handkerchief," Luke offered as he reached into his coat pocket. To his horror, both his handkerchief and wallet were missing. "Is something the matter?" Violet asked, noticing his shocked expression. "I think I just got robbed," he replied, his mind going back to the earlier incident when he'd bumped into the homeless boy. "Oh, I'm very sorry," Violet answered, not quite understanding how that happened. "It's okay. This often happens when one is not careful in large crowds," he answered as he fumbled in his trouser pocket and fished out a bandana, handing it to Violet. "Here, use this." "Thank you," Violet replied as she took the piece of cloth and slowly cleaned up her face. "Are those your bags?" Luke asked, pointing at the two bags lying next to her feet. "Yes," she answered, and Luke noticed she was trying hard not to look him directly on the face. "My cart is on the other side if you will follow me," he said as he picked up the two bags effortlessly and began to walk. Violet slowly followed behind him, the bandana he'd given her still in her hand. She didn't know whether to give it back to him or stash it in her pocket. He walked with a strong gait, and his once blonde hair was now sandy, probably from spending hours in the sun. He was a good-looking man, but not breathtaking. Violet also noticed that he seemed a bit aloof and not as enthusiastic to see her as she had expected. Well, she was here now, and she just had to make the best out of the awkward situation. They reached where his cart was, and Luke placed both her suitcases on the back seat and climbed in on one side. "Give me your hand," he said to Violet, and it sounded more like an order than an offer to help. Violet stretched out her arm, and he took her hand, quickly hoisting her up next to him. She suddenly felt self-conscious as she sat so close next to him. He was still quiet, and Violet wondered whether the robbery was the reason. Doubts plagued her mind, making her sad that she was feeling this way when they just met. Maybe he would talk about what was bothering him once they arrived at home, she thought. Luke took the reins in his hands, made a soft sound with his mouth, and the horses started on forward. They hit a pothole, and Violet found herself violently thrown to his side, her shoulder bumping painfully into him. Her cheeks flushed crimson as she struggled to straighten up and go back to her position. She thought she noticed a smirk on Luke's face, and she wanted to slap him. He should have known that she didn't ride a cart where she came from, she thought furiously. "How far out is your ranch?" Violet asked, deciding to break the uncomfortable silence. "A few more miles," Luke answered, his eyes trained on the road ahead. "I didn't realize it would be that far." Violet answered, a hint of irritation evident in her voice. "Well, how would you know? You haven't bothered to ask," Luke answered back, his tone icy cold. Violet's heart sank at the tone of his voice. She hadn't been wrong after all. Luke was not as excited about her arrival as she had thought he would be. In fact, he seemed to be upset that she was here. Why had he let her come all the way only for him to treat her this way? A sharp, stabbing pain ripped through Violet's heart, and she bit down hard on her lip as she fought back tears. Chapter 7. Luke stared straight ahead, unwilling to look in Violet's direction. He felt awful that he had answered her in that manner, but he couldn't help himself. His lingering doubt had grown since he sent her money to come, and he couldn't understand why he had not been honest with her. The feeling that he was making a big mistake marrying someone he didn't know weighed him down in the days prior to her arrival, and he'd turned into drowning his sorrows at the saloon. Asking Violet not to come after the effort his brothers had put into welcoming her would make him seem like a coward. The night before her arrival, he hadn't slept a wink. He lay tossing and turning in his bed, too afraid to acknowledge that he would be picking up Violet from the train station the next morning. Storm had noticed how quiet Luke had been at the dinner table that evening, and he knew that something was wrong with him. "Your bride will be arriving tomorrow, Luke. Have you spoken to the priest who will be officiating at your wedding?" Storm asked him as soon as the other brothers had left the table. "No, I haven't. Is it not too early?" Luke answered, and Storm noticed the lack of enthusiasm in his voice. "How is it early, Luke? You are to be married in a week's time, and there is a lot to be organized before then," Storm answered. "I will do it once she has arrived. I don't see what the fuss is all about," Luke said as he yawned to indicate his disinterest at what Storm was talking about. "I don't know what's eating you up, Luke. I hope you don't expect me to come to your rescue again once everything starts going south," Storm replied as he stood up and walked down the hallway to his bedroom, marking the end of the conversation. Now, Luke stole a quick glance at the young lady who sat ever so quietly next to him. Her face was crestfallen, and Luke could have sworn that her eyes glistened with tears. She was attractive and carried herself with poise. He wished she had a defect that he could have used to send her back to her home. Unfortunately, she was quite the opposite. She was beautiful and elegant, with an aura of a good and comfortable upbringing about her. He would have to pull himself together and finish what he'd started. Violet felt Luke's eyes on her, and she struggled to keep a straight face without telling him what she thought of him. She wondered how this marriage would work when one party was clearly not interested. How had it come to this? Was her loathing for her uncle so bad that she was considering going through with this farce of a marriage? Whichever way she looked at it, she was doomed. "We should be there in a short while," Luke said, startling her. His voice sounded calmer, and she began to think that she could have misunderstood his mood earlier. "That's good to hear. I'm already developing cramps from sitting on this bench," she answered, and she thought she saw a hint of a smile on his face. "Not to worry, miss. We will be there in no time, and you will have plenty of time to freshen up and have some much-needed rest." Luke answered, his voice sounding even kinder, and Violet's heart sang. "I'd prefer if you addressed me as Violet, sir," she said. "And I, if you called me Luke," he said, this time a smile evident on his face. "What kind of a house do you have?" she pressed on now that his mood was better. "Oh, it's a normal house. Nothing special about it other than the fact that I live there with my 5 brothers," he replied nonchalantly. "What 5 brothers? You never mentioned any of that in your letters," she shrieked. "Well, you never asked now, did you?" he answered. "I think that's something you should have pointed out even without my asking, don't you think?" She answered, her voice choking with tears. "Well, that's how it is. I suggest you start making peace with the situation, Violet," he answered, his face turning into ice once more. And just like that, the magic was gone. Violet swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it hard for her to breathe. Tears blurred her sight, and all she wanted was to catch the next train back to New Orleans. She must have been out of her mind thinking that Luke would ever mellow towards her. How wrong has she been to hop into that train and come out here? She wasn't one to let her vulnerability show, but all she wanted at that moment was to curl down on the floor and bawl her eyes out. "It's the second house with the big shed outside," Luke said, as if nothing had happened. Did he really expect her to answer him back? Violet swallowed a huge lump of saliva and bit down harder on her trembling lip. She couldn't believe that he was that oblivious to the agony she felt after their short conversation. He was hard enough to get along with. How would his brothers be like? How would she live in a house full of grown men? Questions plagued her mind as they drew nearer to the house. The joy she felt finally leaving her home was now turning to sadness, and she found herself wondering whether she was doomed to spend the rest of her years alone and unhappy. Chapter 8. Luke quietly steered the horses to the front of the house, tagged on the reins a little harder, and they came to a halt. Violet surveyed her surroundings. The house was a nice-looking two-storied brick house with a well-kept yard. It was better than she had imagined a house on a ranch to be like. Luke hopped out of the cart in one swift motion and walked over to Violet's side. She sat quietly, her gaze cold and distant. Luke wondered whether she was aware that he was standing by her side, his hand stretched out towards her. "We are home, Violet. Give me your hand," Luke said, and without uttering a word, Violet gave him her hand, and he helped her down. He walked to the back of the cart, pulled out her 2 suitcases as he motioned for Violet to follow him to the front door. This was not how he'd thought this would turn out, but he had no one else to blame other than himself for not calling off the whole arrangement when he had started developing cold feet. Surely Violet's cold attitude would be clearly visible to his brothers, and especially Storm, who would without a doubt besiege him with questions that Luke didn't have answers to. "You could try putting on a happy face when you meet my brothers," Luke said, irritation evident in his voice. "Maybe, if you had been truthful with me from the beginning, I'd be jumping for joy," Violet sarcastically answered back, and Luke was taken aback. She would not be easy to control, as he had thought after all. Agitated, Violet closely followed him through the long hallway, as her eyes carefully studied her entire surroundings. The walls shone brightly from what she could tell was a new coat of paint, and she couldn't help but wonder whether all this had been done in preparation for her arrival. But who would have gone through all this trouble, she wondered. Clearly, it had not been Luke, whose demeanor from the time they met hadn't been pleased. Maybe the house needed a facelift, she concluded. They came to the end of the hallway, which opened through to a big, sparsely furnished drawing room with a large dining table tucked near a big window. Heavy turquoise drapes, which Violet could tell were a bit dated, hung from the rails. The setup was enough to show her that there hadn't been a woman's touch in that house in a long time. Directly opposite was a couch and 2 armchairs, where she saw 5 male figures seated as they watched the pair walk in. They had been having a conversation, but they all fell silent as soon as she and Luke stepped into the room. Violet wanted to turn back and run away as courage failed her, but she quickly pulled herself together. Luke placed both her suitcases on the floor and motioned for her to come forward. This was to be her new family, and the sooner she became used to them, the better, she thought, as she felt the 10 pairs of eyes watching her every move. "Everyone please meet Miss Violet Dixon," he announced as they all stood up as if in unison and tipped their hats to her. She was lost for words and stood there awkwardly as she waited for Luke to save the situation, her palms clammy with sweat. "That is my eldest brother Storm, and then Eric, Thomas, Henry, and Greg." Luke introduced his brothers, and they nodded politely as each of their names was called out. "Hello, everyone," Violet said as soon as Luke finished the introduction. "Please have a seat, Miss Dixon," the eldest brother Storm said as he showed her to one of the armchairs. "Would you like a hot cup of tea, perhaps, before you freshen up?" "No, thank you. I would rather freshen up first," Violet answered. "Okay, Luke, show Miss Dixon to her room," Storm instructed his brother, who stood beside him looking bored out of his wits. He could at least pretend on the first night, Storm thought furiously. His younger brothers looked on wordlessly, that awkward moment not lost to them. "Violet, if you will follow me," Luke said, as he picked up her luggage and headed towards the staircase at the end of the hallway, with Violet closely behind him. Storm watched them as they walked down the hallway, and his heart sank. Luke looked disinterested, and he could tell the young lady was furious, though she tried very hard not to show her emotions. He could tell right away that she was well bred, and it made him a bit sad that Luke couldn't see that aspect of her. Once again, he'd stepped in, saved the situation, and he had a nagging feeling that wasn't going to be the last time, judging from his brother's behavior. "This is your room. There is a bathroom with a wash basin where you can freshen up. You will join us for dinner after you are done," Luke said as he walked in, placed her suitcases on the floor, and walked out without another word. Violet's eyes filled up with tears and a lump swelled in her throat. Luke was no longer trying to hide how much her presence was inconveniencing him. Was this the way to welcome someone you are to marry? She wondered as the tears now flowed freely. All that she had imagined awaited her in Denver was nothing but a mirage. A deep hatred for her uncle built up within her, and she blamed him for her tribulations. She had grown up believing that her uncle loved her as much as she loved him. All that had come crashing down with the death of her father. But she was not one to give up easily, inasmuch as her heart was shattered. Prosody. Chapter 9. Luke walked back down the stairs, his mind racing. It's been 2 weeks since he'd visited his favorite place, and he couldn't contain himself anymore. It would not be easy to sneak out past Storm, but he was going to try. If his brother wanted to discuss anything with him, it would have to wait till the following day. He decided to stay until after dinner, and then he would quietly leave. That would make him look like he cared. But how was he going to keep visiting the saloon with Violet around, Luke wondered. He regretted the day he placed his ad in the Matrimonial Times. How is Miss Dixon coping with her new surroundings? Greg, the youngest of the brothers, asked as soon as Luke walked into the drawing room. "Fine, I guess," Luke answered as he lazily dropped on the couch. "What do you mean, you guess? Haven't you asked her?" Thomas pressed, aghast at his brother's casual tone. "She hasn't stated otherwise," Luke replied, wishing his brothers would stop interrogating him. "This is not the way to treat a lady, Luke. She has come all this way for you. I don't understand why you are behaving like this." Storm finally spoke out from where he sat, anger etched in his face. "I noticed her face was downcast when you both walked in. She didn't look happy to be here, and I could have sworn her eyes looked like she had been crying. Did you have a fight on your way here? Violet is my problem. I don't understand why you keep poking your nose where it doesn't belong. So what if she looked unhappy? She must have been tired from her long trip." Luke barked as his brothers looked at him in dismay. An uncomfortable silence followed. "I don't think it is right to speak to Storm like that, Luke. He's been nothing but helpful to you," Eric finally spoke. Of the 6, he was the quiet one, and only spoke when need be. "I'm sorry, Storm. I didn't mean to be rude. I just have so much in my head, and I don't know where to start," Luke said. He knew better than to fight with Storm, who has always been his lifeline, but he had now let his anger get the best of him. "I understand, and that's why you need our help. In fact, when do you plan to have the wedding? You can't live in the same house with Miss Dixon for a long period of time without getting married." "People around Denver will start talking," Storm said. "Why would they talk? Aren't all my brothers in the same house with me to chaperone us?" Luke shot back. "That's true, but we can only do so for a short time," Storm answered, and he could see that Luke was very preoccupied with something else, and it wasn't Violet. The brothers fell into an uneasy silence, each lost in their own thoughts. It was a known fact that Luke was impulsive, and none of his plans ever worked out. Storm had always been there to clean up his mess, but this time around, he ought to leave Luke to do this on his own. The way he had gone about searching for a bride, though not unheard of, was a first even for him. So lost were they in their thoughts that they didn't hear Mrs. Anderson walk in. Storm had hired her to be their cook for a few days until Violet was familiar enough around the kitchen. She had gracefully agreed to help. "Dinner will be served in a short while, boys. Where is our special visitor?" the cheerful lady asked as she threw a knowing look at Luke. "She's upstairs in her room. Come to think of it, she's taken quite a long time to come down. I think I should go and check on her," Luke said. "That is a good idea, Luke. You should go and bring your bride down for her first meal in her house," Storm said to the amusement of the brothers as well as Mrs. Anderson, but it was clear that the joke was lost to Luke. He pensively stood up and left the room. All he wanted was for the dinner to be over so he could sneak off to the saloon. Ealing. Mrs. Anderson went about setting up the dinner table as the brothers conversed among themselves. She had known them since they were born, and after their parents passed away, she had taken it upon herself to check in on them whenever she could. She was particularly proud of Storm, who had stepped into the gap and raised his siblings the best he could. Of course, it was no secret that Luke was always getting into trouble, and Storm was always there to offer his help. Having been widowed at an early age and never remarried, Mrs. Anderson always felt that the 6 brothers were like the children she hadn't had. When Storm reached out to her to be their cook for a few days, she had jumped at the offer, mostly because it was rare for Storm to burden anyone with his troubles. The money was a good incentive as well. The thought of a woman finally gracing the house was something that she had looked forward to for a long time. The younger brothers, Eric, Thomas, Henry, and Greg, seemed to be taking their time, probably waiting for their elder brothers to settle down first. After Storm's marriage fell apart, she had offered to help him through the process, but he was adamant that he would be fine. And he had. She prayed that he would get over Dorothy and get married again, but that had been a pipe dream. She wished for him to become a father, as she knew that he would be the best. Maybe Luke's marriage would make him think in that direction once again, she mused. Chapter 10. Violet stood in front of the mirror, slowly brushing her long blonde hair with firm but smooth strokes. It felt good to have it hang loose after having it tied up in her bonnet for so long. She had chosen to wear a long pastel gown with a wide skirt for dinner, as well as a pair of white lace gloves which went all the up to her elbows. Deciding she looked good enough, she walked back to her bed and sat on the edge, her mind racing. She remembered everything that had gone wrong since she arrived in Denver, and suddenly didn't feel like going downstairs to join the others for dinner. After Luke unceremoniously left her alone in her room earlier, she quickly wiped away the tears from her eyes and began to survey the room. There was no time to be weak. She could tell that the bed frame, as well as the bedding, was all new, and the room had recently been scrubbed clean. The curtains on the window were clean as well, and it was obvious that someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make sure that she was comfortable. There was also a small reading desk in one corner, and she couldn't be happier as she needed to write to Charles, her lawyer, as soon as she got a chance. Her mind wandered to Luke's brothers. Unlike what she had thought of them earlier, they all seemed kind and welcoming. The eldest brother especially had an air of maturity about him, as well as an aura about him that she couldn't quite place. She could tell that Luke's behavior was just that, his. She hoped he might change once they got married, but the fear of uncertainty still gnawed at the back of her mind. She had accomplished what she set out to do, and that was to get as far away as possible from her uncle. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and she answered for the person to come in. "Everyone is waiting for you downstairs. What's taking you so long?" Luke asked as he stood in the doorway. "I was finishing up. We may join the rest now," Violet answered as she threw a shawl around her shoulders and noticed that Luke hadn't said a word about how she looked. He was also shifty, as if he was late to get somewhere, and Violet was holding him up. They slowly walked down the stairs without speaking to each other. Violet wanted to be done with the dinner so she could come back to her room and go to bed. She was getting fed up having to fight with Luke every few minutes. "Here they are," Storm announced, genuinely happy to see them walk in together. Looking at Violet, he sensed the unhappiness he had earlier on, and his heart went out to the young lady. "She's a beauty," Mrs. Anderson exclaimed as she brought the last plate and placed it on the dining table. "Thank you, ma'am," Violet said quietly, her cheeks flushed crimson. She could feel pairs of eyes once again burning into her, and it was all she could do not to turn and run back to her room. "Don't call me ma'am, that makes me feel like an old maid," Mrs. Anderson teased Violet, and all at the table burst into laughter except for Luke. The mood suddenly turned warm thanks to Mrs. Marr. Anderson and Violet slowly began to thaw at the woman's kindness. But every time she looked over to Luke's side, he sat pensively as he slowly chewed on his food, his gaze distant. Violet decided to ignore him and try to enjoy the dinner, which was specially made for her, even though she was seething inside. "How are you finding Denver so far, Miss Dixon?" Storm asked after they'd finished eating as a way to break the ice. "It's different from New Orleans, but as this is my first day here, let me give it a little more time," she answered, this time beginning to feel at ease. This might just work out after all, she thought to herself. "Do you have siblings?" Greg asked, and Storm shot him a sharp glance for being way too forward. "Yes, I have 2 older sisters." Prosody rate 8%. "They both got married when I was younger and moved away," Violet answered with a slight smile on her lips to show them that she wasn't offended. "Well, that must have been lonely," Greg answered, visibly shocked that she grew up practically all alone. "We have all grown up together, and we still are." Violet thought she saw a movement from the corner of her eye, and when she turned to look in Luke's direction, he was no longer in his seat. How could he leave the table and not ask to be excused? Violet couldn't believe how rude the man was. Storm noticed the same as well, and his heart was troubled by the pained look on Violet's face. He was ashamed of his brother, but he didn't know what to do to make the situation better. What was obvious, though, was that Luke was determined to do as he pleased, and poor Violet was in for a rude shock. Long after everyone had gone to bed, Violet lay awake as dark thoughts plagued her mind. Luke had suddenly left without telling anyone where he was going, and hours later, he still hadn't returned home. This was her first day out here, and he didn't have the courtesy to spend it with her. He had left her with his brothers, and thank heavens, they were nothing like him. She felt bad for having misjudged them earlier. But as good as they were, she had come here intent on marrying Luke, and not even their good hearts could protect her from the pain she felt inside. She would write to Charles soon to let him know where she was, and to probably ask for his advice on what he thought about her situation. She had a feeling that he would not be approving of her decision, but it was done already. Sleep was hard to come by, and when it finally did, Violet dreamt of her father, and he was reassuring her that everything would work out fine. Chapter 11. In the days that followed, Violet learned more and more about the man she was to marry, and his actions shocked her. He was a far cry from the gentleman that she had first started corresponding with back in New Orleans. It shocked her that she had been such a bad judge of character. But then again, she'd known her uncle since birth, and yet he had betrayed her in such a terrible way. Going back home was not an option, as she wasn't ready to face her uncle or answer any of his questions. He must have already known by now that she had run away, and she could only imagine how furious he was. She had written to Charles explaining why she had taken this decision, and that's all that mattered. Luke was dragging his feet about setting the date for their wedding, and Violet was getting fed up. Thoughts of wanting to ask Charles to send her enough money from her fund so she could start a new life without Luke ran through her mind, but she decided to give it a little more time and see whether he would change his ways. In his letters, he had assured her that they would get married in a few days after her arrival in Denver, but now she couldn't see that happening. He would disappear for long periods of time, and she would be lucky if she saw him twice a day. As she wasn't his wife yet, she refrained from asking for explanations from him, choosing to let him be. His brothers helped her feel at home, but she sensed that they always held back whenever she'd ask about Luke. They probably didn't want to hurt her feelings, but as it stood now, nothing she could find out about Luke would shock her, or so she thought. Mrs. Anderson was a great help, of course, spending a lot of time with Violet in the kitchen. She was now becoming familiar with her surroundings, and soon enough she would be going to the general shop by herself. Thinking about all this would excite her, and then she would think about her fiancé, and sadness would engulf her once again. "A penny for your thoughts, Miss Dixon." A voice startled her from her thoughts, and she turned around to see who it was. Storm stood in the doorway holding his wide-brimmed hat in his hands. His face was calm, and Violet felt a warm, soothing feeling wash over her whole being just from his presence. This was not the first time she felt like this. The way he had welcomed her on the first day she arrived at the ranch gave her the same feeling. But at the time she had interpreted that to be relief after how angry she had been with Luke. "Mr. Lucas, thanks for your concern, but it's nothing that should worry you," Violet answered, trying her best to sound upbeat. "Come now, Miss Dixon. We are soon going to be family. You can talk to me if something is troubling you." Storm pressed on, and he thought he saw a slight smile on her lips. "Okay, but please call me Violet," she answered, the smile now quite evident. "All right, Violet, as long as you address me as Storm as well," he said, returning her smile. "Have you heard from Luke? I know he hasn't been home since yesterday morning," she asked, her smile fading. "No, I haven't, but I'm sure he is fine whenever he is," Storm answered, struggling not to look her in the eyes. The deep pain clouding them cut through him like a sharp knife. Damn Luke. He would hear from him once Storm saw him. "You know what? Let me take you for a ride to see the ranch. Have you ridden on a horse before?" "No, I haven't," she answered, as her eyes lit up and the sad moment was forgotten. "Too bad. I'd have had you ride Thunder. He's a joy to ride and very receptive to strangers." "Not to worry. We will both take my horse Columbus," he said, happy that she seemed to love the idea. "Okay, go get yourself ready and meet me outside in half an hour." Prosody. Violet couldn't understand why she was smiling as she hurriedly splashed water on her face and fumbled around looking for a shawl to cover her shoulders. Her heart thundered loudly inside her chest, and she couldn't explain why she was feeling this way. Feeling that she was ready for her first ride on a horse, she threw a last glance in the mirror and then headed outside to where Storm stood patiently waiting for her. "I can see it's true you haven't been on a horse ride before." Storm chuckled as Violet came through the front door. "Why do you say that?" Violet asked, her eyes staring at him innocently. "We have completely different riding attire than what you have on," he said as he looked at her long, white, flowery dress with a lace shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "What must I do then?" she asked as her heart sank thinking that he was about to change his mind. "It's all right. We can make do with what you have on now. With time, though, you will learn our ways," he said, amused at her panicked look. Storm hoisted her up at the front of the saddle, sitting her sideways. To reach the reins, his arms went about her, and suddenly Violet thought that this had been a terrible idea. She stole a quick glance at Storm, and he seemed oblivious of how uncomfortable she felt. Feeling childish, Violet settled back as Storm pulled hard on the reins, and Columbus started on a slow trot. Chapter 12. Our ranch starts at that hedge over there to as far as the eye can see. We inherited it from my parents, and I hope we have made them proud, Storm said, as a sad look spread over his face when he spoke about their parents. "I like that it is so green. I'm sure your parents are proud of you and your brothers," Violet said, as her eyes swept over the vast land, truly mesmerized by its beauty. "How big is it?" "It's over 2,000 acres, he replied. "That's quite huge, I guess," Violet answered, unsure of how big an acre was supposed to be. "Yes, it is. We couldn't possibly cover all of it in one day, especially not now when it is this hot," Storm said, his brow glistening with sweat. He reached into his trouser pocket, removed a handkerchief, and wiped his forehead. Violet watched all his movements from the corner of her eye. A comfortable feeling she couldn't explain had settled over her just by being in Storm's presence. Why didn't she feel like this when she was with Luke? She was the man she was to marry after all. That feeling both excited and terrified her. Storm was also studying her as they rode along. Since he'd first laid eyes on her, he'd been overcome by a strong urge to protect her. He had not felt this way since the first time he'd met Dorothy, and never again since she'd left. He willed his heart to not let him down, as Violet was here to be Luke's wife. Probably what he felt was a deep affection for his future sister-in-law. He tried to convince himself. "We can rest a bit under that willow tree," Storm said, as he pointed towards a big tree with a magnificent shade underneath. Violet nodded her head in agreement, happy to take a break from the scorching sun. Storm brought Columbus to a halt, climbed down, and then helped Violet off the saddle as well. She was glad to be off the horse and immediately went to sit under the tree in the shade. Storm watched her movements, and he could tell that she was a well-poised lady. An urge to know her better came over him as he went to sit down beside her. "Have you always lived in New Orleans?" he asked. "Yes, born and raised there. Have you always lived here?" She threw the question back to him, and they both laughed. "Yes, born and raised here as well. It was a lot of fun growing up here with my parents and my brothers," he sighed, and Violet could see how much he missed those days. "I wish I could say the same. My mother passed away when I was still a child, and shortly after that, my siblings got married and moved away. I was left with my father. Well, that was until he passed away," Violet said as her eyes filled up with tears. "I'm sorry to hear about your father. I still remember how hard it was for us when our parents died," Storm said. He wanted so badly to wrap his arms around her to comfort her, but he knew that it would not be appropriate. "How did they die?" Violet asked. "Their carriage fell off a cliff while they returned home from a wedding ceremony. They were both killed instantly," Storm answered, and Violet could see how pained he was just by talking about them. "How did yours die?" he asked after a brief silence. "My mother died from the flu, and my father had a tragic accident at his place of work," she answered. She wanted to tell him all that had transpired after her father's death, but she restrained herself. That was a conversation she would have later with her husband. "Well, I think we should be heading back now. Luke might have come back and could be looking for you," Storm said as he stood up. "Yes, that is a good idea." Violet replied and immediately felt ashamed for having enjoyed Storm's company more than she should have. The ride back home was quiet, both of them engrossed in their own thoughts. Storm rode Columbus faster, eager to take Violet back home. He had only wanted to get her out of the house to cheer her up, but now he felt guilty of feelings that were threatening to cloud his judgment. He felt as if he needed to explain himself to someone. What was happening to him? Violet was faring no better. She wished she hadn't agreed to ride with Storm. But was it so wrong to get to know one's future brother-in-law? She asked herself, but it only felt as if she was trying to justify the feeling Storm had awoken in her. It didn't help matters that they lived in the same house and would be crossing paths whenever the family was together. They both heaved a silent sigh of relief when they arrived back at the ranch. As Storm helped Violet from the saddle, he avoided any close eye contact. Violet, too, was careful to not get any closer, and the situation couldn't have been any more awkward. As she thanked Storm and turned to walk into the house, a movement caught her attention, and she turned to see who it was. It was Luke, and he looked furious as he menacingly walked towards her. "You've been here hardly a week, and already you are leaving the house alone," he thundered. Violet stood rooted to the ground, unable to speak. She turned to see whether Storm would come to her rescue, but to her dismay, all she saw was a cloud of dust as Columbus disappeared down the road. Chapter 13. "How dare you speak to me like that?" Violet asked, finally finding her voice. The bitter feelings she had been harboring for Luke reached a boiling point, and she couldn't contain herself any longer. "Where did you spend the night?" she went on, now furious. "You have no right to ask me that. First, you need to answer my question," he yelled again. "I have every right to know," she answered in a calm voice, and Luke was taken aback. He had expected her to yell back, but she seemed to keep her cool. "I brought you to Denver, didn't I? You should thank me, you know," he sneered. "I don't think so. You brought me here under false pretenses. You are never home, and I have to rely on your brothers for company," she answered, tears now glistening in her eyes. "Maybe you should return to New Orleans if that's how you feel," he answered without an ounce of guilt. "Well, maybe I should," Violet yelled out, this time unable to control her emotions anymore. She then turned and ran into the house, her tears now freely flowing. Once in her room, Violet threw herself on her bed and wept bitterly. Finally, Luke was revealing his true colors, and it was more than she could bear. She could tell from his behavior that he was trying to mask his trysts, and that's why he approached her in that manner. She had smelled liquor and tobacco smoke on his clothes as he was yelling at her. On top of being a liar, he was a drunkard as well. God only knew what else he engaged in while he was out there with God knows whom. Finally, after calming herself down, Violet decided that she was going to write to Charles and ask him to bring her enough money so she could start afresh, far away from Luke and his brothers. She walked over to the small writing desk and carefully penned a heartfelt letter to Charles, detailing all that she was going through. She would ask Storm to help her mail it at the post office in town the following day. Even though she had vowed to herself to keep distance between her and Storm, she needed his help this one more time. After that, she would be gone, and they wouldn't see each other anymore. She would ask him that evening, she decided. That evening, as they all sat having dinner, Storm avoided looking in Violet's direction, and she kept her head down. As was the norm nowadays, Luke finished up before everyone else and left the table without excusing himself. All that was not lost to Storm, who cast a quick, sorrowful glance at Violet, whose face remained downcast for the rest of the dinner. "Storm, may I have a quick word with you?" Violet asked as soon as they were done with dinner. "Of course, Violet. What do you need?" Storm answered. "I need for you to mail a letter for me tomorrow at the post office," she said. "I'd be happy to Violet there, but why don't you come with me so you can learn your way around? You might need to go there by yourself sometime in the future," Storm answered, and he wanted to kick himself for asking her to be alone with him once again. "That sounds like a great idea," Violet answered, a part of her excited that she would be spending more time with him once again. That agreed upon, they bid each other a good night and both went to their rooms. Storm could hardly find any sleep as he thought about what was happening to him. After Dorothy ran off with the traveling merchant years back, he had vowed to never allow another woman to have that much control over him. He decided that he would die a bachelor, and it had been so until Violet's arrival. Why did it have to be her who aroused these feelings inside him? It didn't matter how badly Luke behaved, Violet was still his fiancée. He would have to find a way to distance himself from her. He would take her to the post office the following day as promised, and then stay away from then on. Violet tossed and turned in her bed as she thought about the situation she was in. All this could have turned out quite differently had Storm been the one who'd placed his ad in the newspaper. He was the complete opposite of his brother. Though reserved and sometimes seemingly aloof, Violet could tell that he was a kind, gentle man. She was growing quite fond of him, and she knew she would miss him terribly when she finally left. The realization that she wouldn't be seeing him again pained her, but she had no other way out. It was hard for her to accept that all her well-laid-out plans had hit a snag. There was no reason for her to stay on and fight a battle that she was clearly losing. She didn't know where she would be going, but as soon as Charles brought her the money, she would come up with a plan. She always did. It was almost a week since she'd arrived here, and none of Luke's earlier promises of marriage had come to fruition. There were no preparations going on, and Luke showed no interest. She was lucky, though, that she wasn't alone with him. How sad would her father have been to see her now? But all this was happening because of her uncle, and she didn't think she would ever forgive him for running her out of her home. Chapter 14. Chapter 14. Charles's letter arrived a week later, and Violet was over the moon as she read it. He had agreed to bring her the money and was very sympathetic to the hardships that she was experiencing in Denver. He would hand over the money at the post office. Charles had insisted that she meet him alone, which she found a bit odd, but assumed that since it was about money, the fewer people knew about it, the better. On the day that she was to meet with Charles, Violet woke up early and quickly prepared to leave before the sun rose too high. She had requested from Storm the night before if he could allow her to ride in the cart to town. He agreed and also offered to have one of the farmhands go with her. Luckily for her, the man arrived early and they were soon on their way to the post office. "Should I come in with you, ma'am?" Jeffrey, the farmhand, asked when they arrived. "No, Jeffrey, wait for me here. I won't be long," Violet answered as he helped her down. The inside of the post office was dimly lit as Violet walked in. She headed straight to where the young postmaster usually sat, but there was no one there. That was strange. How could the post office be open with no one inside? She wondered. Suddenly, a figure emerged from behind the counter, and Violet almost dropped to the floor in shock. It was her uncle, and he was holding a pistol in his right hand. "Hello, dear niece. We meet again," he sneered as he walked towards her, and Violet took a step back, her heart pounding so loudly inside her chest she could hear it. "What are you doing here? And where is Charles?" Violet asked suddenly, afraid for her lawyer. "Don't worry about Charles, dear. He should learn to store his documents in a safe place. Now I believe we have unfinished business to tend to," he growled. "I don't think so. I need to go back to my house. I have someone waiting for me outside," she said, hoping to spook him. She could now see the postmaster on the floor behind the counter, all tied up. "Which house? To the man who doesn't want to marry you? You should have agreed to my proposal," her uncle said, and she could tell that he had read the contents in her letter. "I need to leave, Uncle. You can't hold me against my will," she said now, almost in tears. "I don't think so. My dear, you are coming back with me to New Orleans and we will get married as I had planned," he said as he walked towards her, grabbed her arm, dug his pistol into the small of her back, and ordered her to walk out quietly. Jeffrey watched as Violet walked out of the post office with a mean-looking old man following closely behind her. He could tell that something looked out of place, and an uneasy feeling settled at the pit of his stomach. He called out to Violet, but she just threw him a sad glance and kept walking. Now fully convinced that something was terribly wrong, Jeffrey raced the cart back to the ranch to inform his boss of what he had witnessed. "Why are you doing this to me, Uncle Robert?" Violet asked as he tied up her hands and ordered her to sit quietly inside the carriage. They were leaving right away for New Orleans. "This wouldn't be happening if it wasn't for your stupidity. Did you think I wouldn't find out where you were?" he said, an evil grin on his face. Violet sat back quietly, her mind racing. She wasn't sure whether Jeffrey had realized what was happening. She sighed in resignation, realizing that she wouldn't be seeing Storm ever again. She wondered if Luke would realize that she had vanished and whether he would even care. She didn't think so. The carriage raced down the street with her uncle sitting by her side with a mean, cold look on his face. The sound of loud gunfire startled Violet from her sleep, and she sat up dazed, wondering what was going on. The events of the day had left her so exhausted that she didn't realize when she fell asleep. She stretched out her arms to pull herself up and look outside, only to find that her hands were still bound together. "Stop the carriage at once and release the young lady," someone shouted, and Violet realized that was Storm's voice. He had come to rescue her. Suddenly, a pair of strong hands reached inside the carriage and yanked her outside. Darkness covered the skies like a blanket as she was lifted and bundled into another carriage with a dimly lit interior. She saw Eric, Thomas, and another gentleman that she came to know later was the sheriff. Outside, she could hear her uncle shouting and trying to fight Storm and two deputies as they struggled to restrain him. "Violet, you've not seen the last of me. Next time I will kill you like I killed your father. You can't keep what's mine. Do you hear me?" he shouted, and Violet couldn't believe her ears. She had always felt that there was more to her father's death, and now there was no doubt that Robert had been involved. As soon as Robert was hauled away by the sheriff and his deputies, Storm joined his brothers and Violet in their carriage, and they started their ride back home. Violet sobbed from the pain of knowing that her father had died in the hands of his evil brother. Storm sat quietly next to her, held her close to his chest, and she didn't pull back. He let her weep, and he could feel his shirt wet with her tears. It had been a long day for everyone, and all they wanted now was to get back home and put the whole unfortunate incident behind them. For Eric and Thomas, there was no mistaking what was happening between their brother and Violet. They would let Luke know when they arrived back at the ranch. Chapter 15. I love Violet and I want to marry her. Storm told his brothers when they questioned him about his feelings for Violet the following morning. "But this is wrong, Storm. Violet is supposed to marry Luke," Thomas said as he looked at his other brothers for moral support. "I think people will interpret it the wrong way." "I don't care what they think, and neither should you," Storm answered. "How will Luke react to this?" Eric asked. "If he cared, he would be here," Storm answered. "It still doesn't make it right," Thomas insisted, but Storm would hear none of it. "I have made my decision, and that's final," he said, and stomped out of the house. Later that afternoon, he told Violet what had transpired between him and his brothers. It was obvious that they were not ready to accept this new relationship. Storm and Violet vowed to stay together whatever the means. The only solution they could see was to get married and then move to the far end of the ranch, away from his brothers. They received information the day after her rescue that her uncle had been charged for the murder of her father, as well as for her attempted kidnapping, and would likely spend the rest of his life in jail. Violet was relieved that her uncle would not be in her life anymore. He had done everyone a favor by confessing to the murder loudly for all and sundry to hear. "We could use some of my inheritance to build our new home. We could also buy more cattle and horses," Violet told Storm as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. She knew their moving out would put a strain on his finances and wished to help him out. "On one condition, though. I'll pay you back once the business makes a profit. I refuse to accept handouts from anyone," he said lightly. "Of course," she answered, smiling at him, and he took her hand in his. They sat together like that until the sun disappeared over the horizon. Epilogue. Violet heard Columbus's fast gallop and knew that her husband had returned from his day's work on the ranch. She walked over to the range to check on the food, and she was glad to find that it was still warm. Storm had taken longer to return home that evening, but she knew that calving alone was no mean task. She had wanted to go with him, but he knew she got sick at the sight of blood and had politely turned down her offer. It would take him a while to come inside the house, as he still had to check on the stables and ensure all was well. Violet went back to the couch and sat down. Her mind drifted to how far she and Storm had come. 1 year ago, nothing was working out for her since arriving in Denver as a bride-to-be. Her fiancé turned out to be a hopeless drunk who treated her with no respect. She almost lost her fortune to her evil uncle, who was now cooling his heels in jail. But there had been a light at the end of the tunnel, namely Storm. "I have been meaning to ask you something for a while now," Storm said one afternoon as they rode through the ranch days after her uncle's arrest. "You can ask me anything," she replied, feeling that there was nothing in her power that she couldn't do for him. He stopped the horse, dismounted, helped her down as well, and took both her hands in his. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his eyes fixed intently on hers. She almost lost her footing, and Storm caught her just in time. She laid her head on his chest, lost for words as tears rolled down her cheeks. Storm pulled her even closer to him, worried that he'd offended her. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you cry," he said. She looked at him, smiling through her tears. "No, you haven't. These are tears of joy, and yes, I will marry you," she answered, and he brushed his lips on her forehead ever so lightly. They got back on the horse, and as they rode home, he held her close to his body, both feeling each other's warmth. None spoke, as there was no need for words. They broke the news to Storm's brothers that evening. They were shocked, as they hadn't expected Storm to go through with it after their initial resistance. Luke sat brooding in the corner and never uttered a word. Storm and Violet were married that weekend at the chapel in a ceremony that was well attended. Violet looked angelic in her white gown, and Storm couldn't wait to say "I do" to his beautiful bride. As they walked out of the chapel, Violet saw Charles in the crowd. He stood up, waved at them, and then followed them outside. "I came to deliver a special message to you. Your uncle has apologized for all he did to you and has instructed that I transfer all his assets to you. He regrets everything he did to you and your father, and hopes that in future you may find it in your heart to forgive him," Charles said. "All his assets won't bring my father back to life, but I'll put them to good use." "I appreciate his apology as well," Violet answered. They now had enough money to start their new life together comfortably. "A penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Lucas." Storm called out cheerfully as he walked into the house to find Violet staring at a single spot on the wall, deeply engrossed in her thoughts. "Just happy thoughts, Mr. Lucas. Happy thoughts," she answered as she gladly walked into his open arms. They held on to each other tightly, neither ready to let go. Nothing else mattered as long as they had each other. The end.